Hello. So I, 20F, recently married my husband, 26M, following a 6-year romance. We had a quiet ceremony at his aunt's farmhouse property, which was not our original plan. I'd wanted to get married on the beach because it's where we have some of our happiest memories. My husband and I are both water babies who visit the beach at least once a month to unwind and relax, so it's a particular spot for us. I'd already begun searching for places where we could all stay. Like every other bride on the planet, I wanted my wedding to be memorable, and I had even been saving money for a lavish party for the past 5 years. I work in advertising and have a decent salary, but my husband and I used to live modestly and try to save money for the future. We had planned to book one of the nicest hotels with a sea-facing view so that our guests could have a truly enjoyable and luxurious experience. But we had to rethink our plans and scale back significantly since my parents decided to borrow money from me a few months ago, and I couldn't bring myself to say no. Here's some context. My brother, 24M, married a few months ago, although it was unexpected, and they didn't have much planned. He had been with his wife for almost 2 years and proposed to her about a month before they married. It was a very small ceremony with only family and a few friends, but I was pleased for him because it was their wedding and their choice. However, a few weeks after the wedding, my mother contacted me and requested that I borrow $15,000. She told me that my father had suddenly become ill and that it was most likely his diabetes acting up again, but she couldn't face all of the medical bills on her own and needed my help. She told me that the physicians had recommended a specific medicine, but it was extremely expensive because it had to be imported, and she couldn't afford it because their insurance did not cover it. I was concerned about my father's health, so I decided to stand up and lend her the money, no questions asked. I paid him a couple of trips and begged my mother to show me the medical report multiple times, but she always avoided the inquiries. Whenever I visited them, my father was constantly in bed, although he didn't look to be unwell. Even when I asked my mother why he hadn't been sent to the hospital so he could be monitored and treated professionally, she said it wasn't necessary at the time. However, he became ill enough to require the administration of a rare medicine that was not produced here and was not even covered by their insurance. I am not an idiot. After the first few trips, I realized there was something fishy going on with my parents, but I didn't want to blame them until I was certain. It would be a horrible image for me if I accused them of lying to me about a medical emergency in order to borrow money, only to find out later that everything was true. I learned my brother hadn't been visiting our parents, and when I asked why, my father told me that they didn't want him to worry because he was so young and should be focused on his career. Despite this, they were all right with me worrying for them. I did speak with my brother about it over the phone after a few weeks had passed, and he still hadn't seen our father. He said he'd drop by as soon as he returned from his honeymoon. That was news to me, because I had no idea he had already left for his honeymoon, because my parents had not informed me, and neither he nor his wife had posted about it on social media, so I had no idea where he was. When I inquired why he hadn't told me, he explained that he had planned to surprise everyone by returning after a month away, with a collection of images, tales, and recollections from their tour around Europe. He stated that he had no intention of notifying me, but he was concerned when I mentioned that our father was sick, so he felt compelled to respond. He told me that after receiving my concerned text, he spoke with our parents, who assured him that he had nothing to worry about and that everything was good here. He explained that our parents had most likely exaggerated the scenario while talking to me, and I had believed them because I was neurotic, resulting in a misunderstanding. I tried to give my parents the benefit of the doubt by convincing myself that they had been keeping the truth from my brother because they didn't want to ruin his honeymoon or make everyone worried about them, because I knew what I had seen at my parents' house and there was no room for misunderstanding. But then my brother told me that if what I had said about Dad being really sick turned out to be true, he would have felt terrible about not being there for him, because allegedly our parents were supporting his insanely costly and extended honeymoon. All of the warning signs began to go off in my head, so I asked him how much this trip would cost him, and he told me that it would cost our parents at least $12.15, because he and his wife were pulling out all the stops and making the most of their honeymoon by staying in the most expensive hotels and eating at the best restaurants, because they could only do this once. They would also be shopping for a variety of items, which would be funded by our parents. I understood right away where my money was going, and there was no medical emergency at all. There had never been an emergency, so they had no documentation to show me, and had never even been to the hospital. My parents had merely made up the entire narrative narrative in order to raise funds for my brother's honeymoon, which was meant to be their wedding gift. I felt incredibly insulted hearing my brother speak about how our parents went above and beyond just so the two of them could enjoy their honeymoon because they hadn't been able to have a lavish wedding. The money I had lent to my parents came from my wedding fund, and I felt as if I had been stabbed in the back when I discovered that my parents had handed it all to my brother. When I questioned them after that phone call, my parents said that they had to make up a narrative because they knew I wouldn't give them the money if I knew it was going to be spent on my brother's honeymoon. They told me he had been suffering at work and feeling unhappy for a long time, so they wanted him to have some fun without worrying about money. Unfortunately, they were unable to fund it themselves because it would jeopardize their own retirement fund, so they had to borrow money from me. Their rationale was that I was still young and earning, with many years ahead of me to work and earn this money back. But it was not the same for them. They also stated that it was only money and that they would return it at some point. But for the time being, I simply needed to put myself second and consider my brother's sentiments, since this honeymoon had supposedly revitalized him and saved him from depression. I couldn't believe it because it meant I'd have to reduce my wedding spending for no reason. To be clear, I was fine with having a smaller wedding as long as my father's health did not suffer, but this was not what I had signed up for. I was upset when they told me the truth, and I demanded that they repay me before I married because I intended to use the money for my wedding. I had a lot of fees to consider if I wanted to have a beach wedding, and while my husband and his family were financing part of the costs, I still had to look out for myself. My parents had never planned to pay for the wedding, since they had informed me very early on that they could either pay for my college education or pay for it when I married, but not both. I had planned to go to college and pay for my wedding on my own, so I've been saving up for it alone. In case any of you are wondering, when my brother entered college, I asked him whether my parents had forced him to choose between these two as well, and he laughed in my face as if it were the most absurd concept ever. I never brought it up with my parents because I didn't want to accuse them of having a favourite, even though it was obvious that they did. But I was young and still needed their aid because I hadn't gotten a job at the time, so bringing these issues up and fighting with them would only make everything worse for me, and confronting them about it made no sense. However, it came out several years later when I confronted them about the money they had stolen from me and how they had always preferred my brother over me. They attempted to dispute it, but it was obvious, and I told them they needed to pay me back because I wasn't going to give up my ideal wedding just because my brother was struggling at work. My parents could mollycoddle him by sending him on an extravagant vacation with their own money, but I hadn't worked hard for 5 years and saved enough for my wedding, simply to have that amount taken away from me and given to my brother. But they told me that they couldn't refund the money to me all at once before the wedding, and that it would take them a few years to do so, and they expected me to be fine with it since, evidently, nothing is more important than family. If I was willing to spend that money on a medical emergency for my father, there was no reason why I couldn't use it to save my brother from falling into depression. But here's the thing, my brother was never going to be depressed about his job since he never took it seriously, which is why he was awful at it and made so little money. He works in sales and his pay is nearly entirely commission-based, so if he does poorly, he has only himself to blame. And while he may have been furious about it, I can assure you that he would never get despondent. He simply didn't care enough about anything because he had been spoiled by my parents his entire life and was unaccustomed to working hard for things, which is why he appeared dissatisfied with his job. That was all it was. But my parents exaggerated it to make it appear as if he was worried by his failures at work and needed to be rescued. It was all a load of nonsense, and I attempted to convince my parents that this wedding was extremely essential to me. They had previously promised my husband and his family that I would cover certain expenses, which would be difficult if I didn't have the money, so they had to do something. But they said they couldn't refund the money to me before I got married, so I'd have to scale back or ask my spouse and his family for help. It got to the point where I was begging them to refund my money, but all they did was shake their heads and say no, saying that they would pay it later but not before the wedding. I left their house crying, and when I returned home and informed my husband what had happened, he was just as angry and even more unhappy as I. He was planning to contact a lawyer, but I told him there was no point because there was no written confirmation that my mother wanted the money for medical reasons or that she intended to return it to me. It had all been informal, with no binding contracts or records to show anything. So even if we did file a case against her, it would only waste more of our money by paying for a lawyer because we would most likely be unable to prove anything. We didn't even have messages in our favour, so everything was verbal and off the record. So, as much as we wanted to go after my parents, we decided against it because it would be fruitless and we didn't want to waste any more money on a hopeless scenario. Instead, we decided to start thinking about how we would adjust our wedding plans. Fortunately, my husband's family stepped in after learning about what my parents had done, and his aunt generously offered to let us use her farmhouse location for free. We had always been interested in the notion of a beach wedding, so his aunt had not proposed it at first. But now that we were looking at other options, she made the recommendation, and I decided to check it out. My husband had visited the location before, but the moment I walked in, I knew it was the one. It was a wonderful location, and even though it was not near the ocean, my husband and I were delighted. His aunt was allowing us to use the venue for free, which gave us even more motivation to start planning around the farmhouse instead. I became preoccupied with wedding plans, which gave me yet another reason to distance myself from my parents. I had already decided that they would not be invited to my wedding, but I was torn about my brother because he hadn't done anything wrong and didn't realize that my parents had borrowed the money from me to give it to him. But he made the decision much simpler for me by calling me after he returned from his honeymoon and berating me for humiliating our parents by requesting that they refund my money. He told me that he had learned about what had happened from our mother and was angry that I was being so difficult about it. Apparently, he thought this was no big deal, despite the fact that he was the one who spent my money and promised to refund it to me as soon as possible. But I just had to suck it up and scale back before the wedding. So that's when I decided how I felt about him, and I didn't speak to any of them after that. Now that I didn't have the complete wedding fund, I couldn't afford a lavish, extravagant wedding. To be honest, I believe it worked for me because the wedding I did have was far more lovely than anything I had envisioned previously. We had to reduce our expectations, but it was worthwhile since we realized that this day was supposed to be about us. We were not the individuals we were attempting to portray in our daily lives, so spending a fortune on a big wedding solely to impress people would be incredibly shallow. We decided to cut the wedding costs and instead do something better with the money we saved. In a way, I'm grateful for how things turned out because my wedding was still lovely and dreamlike, but it lacked the pop and show that I had envisioned earlier. It was a good thing because we were only surrounded by those we loved and who loved us when we celebrated our reunion. I believe that is pretty much all you need for a wedding, so I'm pleased with how things turned out. I posted images from my wedding a few days ago. Everyone in my family who had been asked to the wedding had been given very strong and specific instructions to ensure that my parents and brother did not find out that the invites had already been sent out, as they would throw a tantrum if they did not receive one. That's how we were able to have a private ceremony without them showing up or attempting to intimidate me into inviting them before the wedding. But now that it was finished and everything had gone smoothly, I didn't see anything wrong with sharing the images on social media. However, they discovered it and contacted me the next day, demanding an explanation for why they had not been invited to my wedding. I was surprised that they expected to be invited, given that my previous conversation with any of them had not been good. I had been crying when I left my parents' house following our last dispute, and we hadn't spoken since. The last time I spoke with my brother, he made me feel like everything was my fault and that I was the one who was being theatrical. After that, I hadn't spoken to any of them, and they hadn't sought to talk to me, so I had no idea why they had expected to be invited. They had not only expected me to invite them, but they were also disappointed that they were unable to attend the wedding. My parents called me first, then joined my brother in the call, so they could all yell at me at the same time. But I didn't like it, and it seemed extremely entitled of them. I'd already shut them out of my life, and I didn't need this drama while I tried to enjoy my new life as a bride. So I told them that since they took my money, I needed to decrease the cost of the wedding, so I only invited family and a few close friends, because they were not included on the list. After that, I hung up and blocked them, hoping they would leave me alone. But an hour later, my husband told me that my brother had contacted him to notify us that my parents had been deeply offended by what I had said. My mother was upset, so she kept crying until she almost fainted. That was all he said. But I began to feel guilty because I hadn't meant to offend my parents so deeply. He could be bluffing, but I don't know for sure. And it's made me feel strangely bad since I heard it. AITA for not inviting my parents and brother to my wedding after they stole money from my wedding fund. Update #1. Hello! It's been a week since my last chat with my parents and brother, and I've chosen not to speak to them again. My mother can cry all she wants, but it won't change the facts. I was crying so hard the day I confronted them about the money, and I even begged them to return it to me before the wedding, but they didn't seem to care. They had taken it quite lightly, and now I was going to do the same to them. You reap what you sow. I also warned my brother not to contact me or my husband, particularly my husband, because he had nothing to do with all of this, and I didn't want my family to bother him with their petty antics. I banned him again after that text, since I didn't want my family to have any contact with me. They had mistreated me my entire life, and now I was not going to take it anymore. I vowed that if I could, I would file a lawsuit against them to recover my money. However, given the lack of actual evidence, that may be a long shot at the moment. My husband feels it's worth a shot and might just work, so we've been thinking about it. He has spoken with a reputable lawyer, and we will decide what to do in a few days. Until then, I just need to figure out how to get them to confess or admit that they borrowed the money from me under the pretense of using it for a medical emergency, but then gave it to my brother so he could have a fun honeymoon. It will be difficult to prove in court, but I refuse to let them off the hook so easily. I deserve to have my money returned to me, and I will do everything it takes to ensure that they do it as soon as possible. Update #2. Yesterday, I warned my brother not to worry my husband with our family drama, so he apparently interpreted it as a sign to pull him into this, despite the fact that he is not involved. After we arrived home from work, my husband informed me that my parents and brother had sent him a slew of SMS, demanding that he speak with me and instruct me to unblock them. When he blocked them, they decided to escalate the situation by showing up at his workplace. Apparently, they had been waiting for him right outside, and as soon as they saw his car go, they began tailing him and honking at him constantly, forcing him to pull over and wait for them to catch up because he recognized my brother's car and knew it was them. He also knew that if he didn't stop and wait for them, they'd just follow him home, which would greatly disturb me. So he decided to take one for the team and indulge their nonsense. When he pulled over, my brother exited his car, approached his window, and stated that they wanted to meet with him in person. There was a diner nearby, and my spouse was eager to get it over. They took a booth in the diner so that my family could express whatever they felt was so vital. My brother informed him that he didn't think it was fair for me to cut everyone off over money, and that it was an overreaction. They also thought my implication that we were no longer family, because they had borrowed money from me, went too far. I'd previously blocked them so they couldn't contact me, but they knew that if my husband tried to chat with me, I might just listen. So they were attempting to appeal to him, and my husband could remind me that we were a family nonetheless. So I needed to act like it rather than throwing tantrums over minor misunderstandings and acting like a brat. My parents also stated that they would return the money to me eventually, but it was simply not possible for them to do so all at once, and they had already explained it to me 1,000,000 times. So I needed to be more considerate because my brother was struggling at work and my parents were about to retire in a few years. They were attempting to persuade my husband that this was entirely my fault and that I was acting out for no reason, but my husband handled it quite well, entertaining them and making them feel as if he was on their side. He told them that while he could try to explain it to me, it would be far more helpful if they came out to me personally and wrote me a meaningful note. So far, they had only been accusatory toward me, but my husband persuaded them that if they admitted their mistakes, it would calm me down, and those morons actually believed him. My husband pushed them into sending me a message in which they recognized what they had done, leading them to believe that this would make me go easy on them and that I would end up apologizing to them because tone was everything. It's all nonsense, of course, because as soon as they send that communication, we treat it as an admission of guilt and pursue them criminally. I'm actually very pleased with my husband because he handled this far better than I would, and I think he is an evil genius, but he is my evil genius, therefore I adore him. Update #3. My husband's strategy worked, and we are quite excited right now. My dad and brother, like a bunch of fools, sent me an email listing every single lie they had lied and admitting to everything they had done. So, now that we have documentation, my husband has granted our lawyer permission to proceed with the case, and we will soon receive our money back. $15,000 may not seem like much to other people, but it means a lot to me because I've spent the previous 5 years saving for the future and working really hard to be where I am now. It took a lot of late hours and sacrifices, and I'm not going to let it all go to waste just because my brother is lazy and my parents want to help him. So we'll sue them, and no matter what, we'll get my money back. We've already started arranging our honeymoon, which will be a brief vacation to the beach because that's where it all began and will always be precious to us. We might take a longer break in a few months and treat it like a vacation, but for the time being, this will have to suffice. We recognize that we don't have to impress people or spend a lot of money. We can simply do what makes us happy, and we are doing just that. Also, I don't want to be like my brother, who shared images from his honeymoon after they returned to rub it in people's faces, only to be sued for it. It's incredibly awful for them, but they brought it on themselves, so they completely deserve whatever comes their way.